you're joining us for the first time today, we started this chat last week. Basically, we're all getting back to business, and here at Freeman Group, we've noticed with the work through our clients that there's a lot of great information out there regarding how to wash hands and where to put signs and sanitizer stations and all of the technical aspects, but there's not a lot uh, geared towards how do we handle the new environment with our team members and with our guests, because as we all know, there's a lot of changes that have come our way. So we wanted to start this conversation back to business. Last week, we focused on identifying the types of guests that we have. And today, we want to focus on adapting to the demanding situations that we all know are coming our way. Just to give you a little background, Freeman Group has been in the business for roughly 35 years. We provide customer service solutions and training to hospitality, travel, healthcare industries, all since 1985. Bill Freeman, one of our founding partner, as you can see his last name there, Freeman, once said, when reopening travel, tourism, and hospitality industries, figuring it out as we go is just simply not an option. In fact, training in this pre-COVID-19, as well as in this new environment, really needs to be a strategic business model, but more so in this new environment that we're dealing with and all of the things coming our way. So we've done some of the work and thought for you that we're going to kind of take you through today. Some of the solutions that we build are custom to each of our clients' unique situations, and we work with developing the standards as well as the resources to train those standards to those team members. But today we've got more of a global set of conversations and standards to talk to you that can cross multiple industries. Our goal today is just start the conversation, hopefully pique some questions that you could be asking of your own team members and leaders. And also we want to talk about some of the leadership skills that are going to be very critical in today's new environment. So today I'm joined by one of my partners, Andrew Basor. He's an executive director for Freeman Group, as well as myself, senior project director. I'll let Andrew introduce himself a little bit later on. Today we're going to talk about or revisit the identifying the guest needs that we looked at last week, and kind of the model or scale of the different types of guests we have. We'll talk further about adapting those staff behaviors to those, and then ultimately how to diffuse some of the demanding situations that we know are coming our way. Just some logistics for today. Please feel free to ask questions via the chat function. A Freeman Group moderator will always be available. We're going to keep the lines muted, and then at the end, we will take your questions from the chat and try to answer them live. But ultimately, at the end of all this, the resources, the presentation, as well as the recording will be sent to you all after today's meeting. So if you were with us last week, you may remember we talked about before COVID-19, the guest experience was defined by their reaction or their emotional reaction to one of three areas of ours, whether that was our attitude, skills, or knowledge. And now in the post-COVID-19 environment, the new element, I say new, the perceived safety element is taking center stage. We all know that in all of our industries, safety has been a backbone of what we do day in and day out in our skills and our knowledge. But now the guest is actually going to be more concerned with how they perceive those safety moments. Some of the factors that they'll be looking for or looking at might be the use of our personal protective equipment, or PPE. You know, whether that's guests or staff members, your internal guests' use of PPE, that will be a conscious safety factor moving forward. They also might be looking at the guest queues and waiting areas. You know, is there enough room for us to social distance in the waiting area? You know, you might find the same question could be asked in the yachting sector, for example. Is there enough room in the saloon or the galley to social distance? And if not, is PPE taking its place? Or even at the destinations, the smaller locales that just don't quite have the spacious room, we need to be conscious of that and adjusting according. Same with our food and beverage floor plans. Do we have enough space between the tables, between bar stools? How often are we wiping down the public areas and public surfaces? How often are they seeing us do this as well? Down to our elevator use, have we put restrictions in? Have we thought of the signage that needs to go into the elevator to help with those situations? Another often overlooked area would be the fitness center or the rec centers. What have we done to put in safety protocols in those areas? And more importantly, how are we communicating those to the guest? We talked last week a lot about the expectations of guests. 91% expect to see enhanced safety measures, but they also expect those to be communicated. So how are we delivering that information to them will be a factor. Even the transportation services, if you're a destination and you have a third-party vendor that's taking your clients out to an excursion, what methods have that third-party vendor put in place, and what communication are they giving? Because that is wrapped up in our total guest experience for our own guests. And then ultimately, what signage are we putting out in communications? Is it too medical and a little frightening to some people? Do we not have enough or any at all? All of these factors are going to be wrapped up in the conscious guest experience as they go forward. So it's all about perception, more so than ever. And to look at this, I would ask you, which middle dot do you think is bigger here? Just give you a second. And what would you say if I told you they're the same? They're the same size. So pre-COVID-19, we all knew some old adages of customers who complain and how that flow worked. But just to review some of those, we see that only 1% of customers feel that their expectations of good service are always met at an operation. We also see that 91% of customers who've had a bad experience will not do business with our company again. Here's one of the old adages. We know satisfied guests tell very little people, dissatisfied tell the whole world. We also know pre-COVID that only 1 in 26 customers complain and the rest say nothing at all. Now, I mention all of this because in some recent data polls that we've seen, 3,500 Americans, over 1,000 international respondents took place in a poll. And if you remember from last week, 24% of those respondents said they were going to wait for a vaccine to be released before going to a restaurant or a dine-in facility. In that 24%, we saw 50% of those are going to wait 6 months or up to 6 months after the vaccine is released. We saw 26% of respondents were not going to go stay in a hotel until a vaccine is released. So we talked about business is going to be slow coming back before this vaccine, but really that's a 25% on average cut to the people walking in our front door. So now more than ever, their experience is going to translate to repeat business or not. One of the things that we think of when we're working with our clients is you're sitting on a powder keg, essentially. The fire starters of the increased sanitation protocols not being perceived by our guests, or the communications that we gave are just not landing with them, could start some demanding situations. We're going to talk about the challenging conversations that we're going to have, and if our team members don't handle those appropriately, that could start a blaze towards that powder keg. And then ultimately, heaven forbid you have a COVID-19 outbreak traced back to your facility. That's a PR nightmare, as well as we want to take care of our guests and our team members. We want to remain safe. So imagine if any of these fire starters happened with the internet today, how fast that fire would spread. You know, here's a quick example of what happens in 60 seconds on the internet. That's 2.5 million snaps created in Snapchat, or almost 200,000 tweets in a minute. 59 million messages, or 19 million text messages. So when we looked at the one happy guest tells 9 people and an unhappy guest tells 22, well, now expand that reach through the power of social media. So all of this is culminating in the need for us to be on the floor and to help our team members through these processes, as it's all brand new to a lot of people. So I'll turn it over to Andrew, and he'll take us through some of the actual steps we can take to help alleviate that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin. And I am the real Andrew Bay. So I know Kevin's video there says my name, but it's great to speak to all of you today. And thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Kevin, for really setting the scene of this new environment that we are all entering into. And today's conversation are all about those difficult or demanding situations. And the statistics, the examples Kevin just spoke about these fire starters, there's a lot of fires that could potentially be started. And it's about how do we really diffuse those fires and make sure we're setting not only ourselves up, but also our teammates up for success. So let's take a look at some of these specific behaviors and actions that we can all take. If you were with us last week, we talked about this model, this change curve model, and we're going to continue to use this change curve model throughout every one of our webinars, highlighting on different sections of this change curve. And if you're first joining us, just to explain briefly what this change curve is all about, is we see in the process of change and adapting to change, there's really 4 different buckets: denial, resistance, exploration, and acceptance. You eventually get to that acceptance, whatever change you're going through. And for our guests, and not just our external guests, but also our internal guests, they're going through this same change curve model themselves. And sometimes they're on different ends of the spectrum here when we think about change. And one thing to note is this really compares to how we grieve, right? There's different stages of grief. Same thing with change, where there's different feelings, emotions that we all feel when we're encountering these different changes, be it just personally or socially when we're dealing with COVID-19. So we really need to frame this conversation up that we have guests that will fall on different ends of the spectrum. We're gonna have a guest who maybe is dismissive, and they're just kind of in denial about COVID-19 and all of the restrictions that are out there. But then you also have that hypersensitive or hyper-focused guest who is doing everything they can do to make sure when they are exploring that they're protecting themselves. And maybe they're more accepting of what's happening and more willing to get out there because they are wearing that PPE quite a bit, or they are following those stringent policies and procedures. So we're really gonna frame the conversation around these 2 ends of the spectrum. And that doesn't mean every guest is gonna be hypersensitive or dismissive. They could be somewhere along that spectrum. So I just wanna make sure we call that out before we get going. But what you need to be thinking about is, what am I assessing? What am I scanning the room? What am I looking for when I'm encountering these different types of guests? And today's conversation is really gonna be framed up around these triggers for demanding situations. Last week, we talked about some behaviors that they exhibit in just daily and normal interactions. But today, it's all about these demanding situations and what's gonna happen when those fires are starting, and what can we do to diffuse these different triggers. So let's take a first look at our hyper-focused guests and some of these triggers that we're gonna be seeing when we refer to our hygiene and our appearance. So sometimes some triggers, these might be very obvious for our hyper-focused guests, but they're really focused, they're hyper-focused on the hygiene of others. That could be other staff, that could be other guests who are just there in whatever space they're in. Maybe they're consistently looking around and just really scanning that room quite a bit. Maybe they're eyeballing the staff or the guests and really locked in on what actions they are doing or when they're wearing their PPE. They could also be very quick to point out the lack of use to you and really, hey, that person over there is not wearing their mask, and really be hyper-focused on that. They also, some triggers for them is just the application of sanitizer after every interaction. They are doing that, so they expect that of others. And if they're not seeing that, they're not observing others doing the same thing they are, it could be a trigger for a demanding situation. Let's look at some of these environments and some triggers here. They will be using extra caution in these social settings. They might be wiping down everything, even after you touch it, before you touch it, and might have that same expectation of you if you're serving them a drink or if you're putting something on their tray table, right? They might be wiping that down right before. We consistently see, and I've seen this with several clients last week, is the use of and the hesitancy to make contact with something. So that's using their elbow for the elevator, or opening a door with their foot, using some of those metal tools that have been out there. When we see this, that could be a trigger if they're not seeing other people do the same thing and taking those protocols or those proactive steps. They could get angry. They could get frustrated that others aren't taking the same measures. So a trigger, when we see that, we just need to keep that in mind, that it could create a demanding situation. When we refer to these products and services, they really might be attuned to where you're placing your hands and your fingers. Are you serving that glass of wine from the stem, right? Where are you putting your hands on their plates? What are you doing when you're serving these products and services? They also might be hesitant to receive anything from you. I think a great example of this is on our airlines. And if we're delivering snacks or beverages, they might just be, nope, I don't want anything from you. I don't want to touch it, right? Because they're so worried, and that could be a trigger for them of what is happening or where has that product or service been. So they might be refusing these different products and services, or just asking for it to be delivered a little bit differently. And finally, some triggers when it comes to communication. I really think what we'll see here is they might be questioning or second guessing what we're doing, our adherence to these protocols, and just might have some different perceptions of what's going on. Kevin alluded to that earlier, but those perceptions are going to drive these demanding situations, and they're going to create demanding situations because of it. They might be a little more accusatory in the way that they're speaking. See the image there, they're pointing at that policies or procedures document that you gave them, and you're not living up to those promises. They're extremely upset, and that's just going to trigger a demanding situation down the line, right? They're speaking in those personal terms that you did this even though maybe you had nothing to do with that policy or procedure. So really important to pick up on these triggers, and we're going to talk here in a second about some words and phrases we can use to really diffuse these different moments. But these are going to happen. We're entering into this new environment, and we're all going to be encountering some new demanding situations because of these hyper-focused guests, and we really need to pay attention to that. So let's look on the opposite side of the coin here. Let's look at that dismissive guest. And the dismissive guest, maybe their triggers aren't going to be as obvious, right? Because they're not as vocal, or they're not as out there with their PPE use, or really cleaning those surfaces to the way that they like. They're going to be obviously more dismissive and maybe more casual in the way that they display their triggers for demanding situations. So let's take a look at a few when we think about those hygiene and appearance, right? They're probably going to be triggered to have a demanding situation if we're continuing to ask them to comply, right? If we're continuing to remind them of their PPE use, or, sir, can you put your mask back on? Can you please maintain social distancing? That's going to trigger a demanding situation inside of them. They're going to get frustrated. They also might see a perception of other people monitoring their actions, right? You have that hyper-focused guest that's really eyeballing them. They might think now the staff is doing the same thing. They're going to get this perception, and in turn trigger a demanding situation. So we really need to be aware of how are we scanning that environment? What are we doing? How are others doing the same thing to these dismissive guests? When we think about the guest environment, there's some different things here that are at play with this dismissive guest. And they might be more upset, and they might have a trigger because of the restrictions that are in place. So because of social distancing, now they're going to have longer waits and limited capacity. So that is going to trigger them to be upset and frustrated with the situation. Really has nothing to do with what you're doing, but it's the entire COVID-19 environment that's making them frustrated and creating that demanding situation. So we really need to be aware of that. And how do we approach a guest that maybe has seen this type of signage that something is closed, or we have to have that conversation? How we deliver that is really going to go a long way to diffusing that demanding situation. When we think about products and services here, the normal request isn't normal any longer, right? So if I am a dismissive guest and I'm going out and I want everything that I could have had months ago, but that's not the case any longer. So if I'm asking for glassware, if I'm asking for something as simple as a steak knife and we're only providing those single disposable products, or I want some amenities, or I don't want to use pickup service, that's going to frustrate me. I could have had this months ago. Now I can't have my steak knife. I need to cut my steak. How am I going to do it? So it's, again, a trigger to that demanding situation, and how we explain those options and what we say is really going to be crucial in these moments. Those limited options and those limited products and services, yeah, that's something we're dealing with and we're all adapting to. And in some of these instances, we're not going to have many options, but it's about what we say and how we deliver it, which will go the longest way with these dismissive guests. But I think the key thing here is to think about this and to think about how the limitations now on what we can provide are going to produce demanding situations. So we really need to be hyper-focused when we're in our guest houses, airlines, restaurants, hotels. What are those products and services that we're no longer offering? And how are we proactively dealing with these potential demanding situations? How are we preparing our staff to have some options available of those items that are no longer there? So something to think about as we're reopening and getting back to business. And lastly, some of those triggers when we think about communication is really that lack of explanation or proactive communication, right? So if they're not getting anything before they check in, they're expecting everything they used to have. So now they're on site and they're faced with limited options, and that's going to frustrate them. That's going to lead to probably a very tough demanding situation, and could even go into those complaints that they're really upset. And now we're going to have to recover that customer or that guest. One here that I think I just started thinking about because it was my own frustration is just the difficulty of contacting a representative or those new communication channels. I'll give a perfect personal example. I was making a phone call to a golf course. I just wanted to talk to somebody. I just had a question, and I kept getting the loop of that recording that said, due to COVID-19, we will no longer be able to take phone calls. And that loop, every prompt that I was in that loop, I was in that circle. And I found myself just getting frustrated. All I wanted to do was speak to someone and ask a very simple question, but I wasn't able to. And it wasn't anything that they had done wrong, but it's me adapting to this new normal of they're much more focused on the people that are there on site rather than taking my phone call like they would have had the opportunity to in the past. So as we're adapting to this, we have to be proactive here as well and think about that those frustrations are out there. People are engaging with these recordings, and that's going to possibly lead to some demanding situations. So in those cases, we can't just, if we do get a hold of a representative, they can't just be saying, well, I'm sorry. Right? It's not sincere. It doesn't really help to bridge that gap of what I'm feeling and that demanding situation that it created. So something to be attuned to and really make sure we're aware of how we're communicating to these dismissive guests. Things are different. We're probably not going to see a lot of these triggers. Right? They might be a little bit less obvious than our hypersensitive guests, but we really need to be aware of what is going to trigger a demanding situation. So Kevin alluded to it. I talked about it. It's time to take action. And today we're going to give you some very specific verbiage that you can use and test out when you're faced with these demanding situations. I just want to say I don't have the silver bullet here, and I don't think really anyone in this new environment does. What we're going to show you are some suggestive language that we really, based on our experience and with a few clients that we are working with, it works really well. But it's all about the delivery, and it's all about giving our teams the tools to test these things out. And more so, it's about adapting as we go. You might try one of these phrases and it just doesn't work. Let's continue to adapt and try it as we go and practice and get used to these new normals. So we're going to frame up diffusing demanding situations into 4 key steps. And the first step is going to be to reassure our guests. And how are we reassuring those hypersensitive guests? It's very simple, right? I want to update you on the adjustments we've made. Excuse me for a moment while I wash my hands. Now, that alone, you excusing yourself to just say you're going to go wash your hands, in the mind of a hyper-focused guest, they are now at ease. They know you're going to go make sure you're clean and ready to go, and then you're going to come back and take care of them. So just that simple line of asking for them to give you a moment to do that puts them at ease, right? It diffuses that potential demanding situation. Thank you for letting me know, right? They might be telling you things. We need to really be aware of that and thank them for bringing that to your attention. And just assure them that if something did go wrong, well, that wasn't in line with what we have updated, right? You're not blaming someone. You're not going to place blame on another staff member who maybe they're complaining or asking about, but just assure them that that's not the way it's supposed to go. So I assure you that's not in line with our policies. I assure you we haven't been doing that consistently, things along those lines. Right? When we're reassuring our dismissive guest, some key phrases we can stick to here. Everyone's well-being is important to us. Again, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Your comfort is important to us. So instead of focusing on the masses, really make that center to that dismissive guest who might have the perception that everyone is so focused on them because they're not doing X, Y, and Z. So let's take the attention, let's diffuse their feelings and their emotions and really focus it on them, right? Thank you for telling me. I never realized, or I did not realize what was happening, right? That could be an honest response, right? Very sincerely, you just were not aware of what was going around. Maybe you weren't even in the room. Maybe you didn't have that interaction. But again, a great way to diffuse and reassure our guests. Step 2 in these demanding situations is just to stick to the facts, right? Let's just stick to the observations, stick to what the issue is, and really start there and end there. Stick to the facts and don't go anywhere else. So in working with the CDC, we've made modifications too. Right? Be very specific with who it is that you've been working with in that hypersensitive guest conversation to really, again, reassure and stick to exactly what has or has not happened. My team and I have been working to make improvements to your experience and then list off what are those things that you've been doing. I observed, right? So very clearly, this is what I saw. Stick to it, stick to the facts. Or I see that your room has not been cleaned properly. Let me get someone to help. Okay? Again, the facts of what has or has not happened. When we talk about the dismissive guest, here's a great opportunity to just empathize, and we're going to get there in a moment. But again, stick to the facts. I agree. Our limited options can be frustrating. I agree because of social distancing, this is new. I'm still adapting to it as well. Or we're currently unable to provide in-room dining because we want to ensure the guest safety and guest well-being. We're hopeful to expand our seating areas in the next phase. Or give them that information. And again, stick to the facts here. What is happening? What is not happening? Very simple. Our third step is to offer options. And, you know, options are going to be key here. And we need to really think about what options do we have now. The options we used a few months ago are not going to work any longer. So you need to be challenging yourselves and challenging your team to think about options a little bit differently. But some things we can say is, I would be happy to. Do you have any preferences for? Right? So just even asking the guest, what are their preferences? What do you want? And let's see what we can work on or find a nice medium in between. A few alternatives that we have available, a great way to frame it up, right? Just list the options of things you can do in those certain circumstances. This could be anywhere from moving their table to moving their seat on board an aircraft to just changing maybe the way our yachting charter is going to go. We have alternative options, but let's think about those and let's be proactive in those situations. Additionally, when we talk about that dismissive guest, and great example here is that steak knife again. Right? How am I going to cut my steak if I don't have a steak knife and I have to use this flimsy disposable knife? Well, although we have limited options, here's what I can do. Right? Maybe I take it to the back and I cut it, or maybe I bring out a steak knife and I'm able to cut it in front of them and then I take that away. So there are options out there. You're going to have to get a little creative. I apologize, but it's the new environment we live in, and that's what we're going to have to do to really set our guests and our staff up for success. What it could offer is an alternative or a replacement. Maybe they don't want that steak anymore. Maybe they're gonna switch to the salmon. Right? Let's just do that. Let's make that happen because we're now faced with this barrier because of COVID-19. And I think the last one there is really key in restaurants and maybe even in a hotel check-in scenario. But rather than wait, can I contact you when a table is available or when I can check you in next? Let's take it upon ourselves to really cater to that guest's needs. And let's get creative. Get their cell phone number, call them, text them, email them. Plenty of options there. Instead of them waiting or getting frustrated because the wait is taking so long. Let them go somewhere else, let them do something else, and then let's take it upon ourselves to get in contact with them. Before I go into the fourth step, I really want to be cautious and make sure you all understand that we have to be aware. We have to be aware of what we say and how we're saying it. Our inflection, our volume, our tone is so important in this environment. And just using the incorrect tone or inflection or volume in the way we say it can make this conversation go south very quickly. So it's not only about diffusing the demanding situation, it's how we diffuse the demanding situation, which will continue to set those fires. Right? We have that image of all those matches. We need to knock those matches down so they don't continue to light. And by being very attuned to our inflection, volume, and tone, we'll do just that. So when you're talking, when you're speaking, to not only when you're doing it, but your staff, we've got to be hyper-focused on the inflection, volume, and tone that we use. So let's talk about some actions that are going to distract from these conversations. When we're talking about diffusing demanding situations, we always need to be thinking, do I have that deer in headlights look? Am I just frozen in space when I'm dealing with this demanding situation? What am I doing on my nonverbal side that might continue to trigger this guest? Am I just looking around and looking confused, raising my eyebrows? What are my nonverbals really saying to the guest? And when we're talking about our verbals, we need to ask ourselves, am I getting defensive? Am I taking this personally? Or how am I really communicating effectively in this moment? Am I using personal terms? Well, you said, right? Am I taking this personally? Or am I using what I'm saying and how I'm saying it to really help the interaction instead of detract? So let's look at some of those impactful actions. Now more than ever, that consistent eye contact is key. Focus in on your guest. Make sure they are the center of attention, especially if we're wearing a mask. This is the only thing they've got. So make sure you're hyper-focused on your eye contact. One that maybe you haven't thought about is just adjusting your posture. If you have the opportunity to squat down at their table or get to their level on that aircraft, or if we're in a galley on a yacht, what can we do to get to their level and really maintain that eye contact? What also can I remove that might be a distraction? If I'm carrying a tray or if I'm carrying something or pushing something, get rid of it. Let's empty your hands and make sure you have that open body posture. You're available to them and really focused on what they need. And then when we're speaking, start with why. Why are these policies and procedures in place? Don't hide behind them, but let's educate. Let's talk about the why. It's often not what you do, it's why you do it. And I think we really need to be focused in this instance, in this environment, that why is really going to help diffuse these conversations. We also need to tailor our options to that specific situation. There's nothing cookie cutter about any of this. And that's why it's going to take so much time and practice to get used to. So tailor your options to those specific situations. And above all, ask for help. This doesn't mean you need to be on an island by yourself and go through this all alone. Ask other teammates, ask your managers, ask for support, and ask for help. And I think our guests are going to understand that we're all adapting to this new environment. So if you're more willing to ask for help, that's just going to help the conversation. It's something as simple as, you know, I'd love to find a great solution. Let me just go ask my fellow team member, my manager, for some help. Just own up to it. Don't be afraid in these circumstances to ask for help when you need it. But if you ask for help, make sure you apply that to the next time and learn from that demanding situation. Apply those learnings and continue to grow. Before we get to the fourth stage, I want to talk about this quote that it's really stuck with me. And I think even more so now in this environment, we really need to be listening to understand and not just listening to reply. There's a lot happening on why people are dismissive or why people are hyper-focused. And we really need to make sure we're aware and just considering that when we're showing empathy and really adjusting to these demanding situations. I might be someone that has a pre-existing medical condition that might require me to be hyper-focused. And I have more things going on in my head about how I'm impacted than you ever even thought about. Or I just might have never gone outside in the last 3 months and I'm just oblivious to the world. And that's okay too, but we really just need to understand where our guests are coming from and don't just have that premeditated response going. Take the time. It doesn't take any longer to understand when you're listening. Right? So let's talk about empathy. Fourth step, I think it's the most important. That's why it's in green. Green to go here. Empathize and apologize. Really simple. Some things you can say. Thank you for your understanding. As it turns out, great way to start if you have to deliver some bad news. It just softens that conversation quite a bit. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. Right? It is an opportunity. We're given an opportunity to address whatever concern or find an option for them. So give them some kudos, give them some thanks for letting us do that. I apologize for the misunderstanding. I apologize, let me excuse myself to do X, Y, and Z. And then just see what they're comfortable with. Would you be comfortable if I did X, Y, and Z? That allows us to demonstrate that empathy and show that understanding for what that guest might be going through. On the dismissive side, your cooperation is greatly appreciated to keep us all safe. Show that empathy, that true passion, that sincerity when you're delivering these things. I agree, this can be extremely uncomfortable, extremely unnatural. I don't think anybody on this call would disagree with that. It is uncomfortable. It is unnatural. We're all getting used to it. So let's just own up to it. Let's be empathetic in those situations. I apologize for the inconvenience and just thank them again for giving them the opportunity to address. So some key phrases that we can use, we can try out in these demanding situations to really stop this flame from spreading. We don't want all these matches to just continue to light because that's just going to lead to an enormous problem. And like Kevin said, once that fire starts, it's going online, and in 60 seconds, you saw a lot of things can happen. So just multiply that by minutes and hours and days as this situation continues to grow. And if we don't diffuse these situations, if we don't stop these triggers and these fires from starting, it's just going to lead to a bigger issue. So set yourself up, set your teams up to diffuse and distinguish these flames. So how are you going to do this? It's great information, great suggestions, but you know what, Freeman Group, we have you. We've got a guide for you. It's 3 simple steps on how you can help your teams master these demanding situations. And for us, it all starts with our standards of performance. It's followed up by a very practical and specific training solution. And it ends with on-the-job coaching. So it's the what, the how, and when are these things happening that we really want to start and infuse in all of your organizations. You have to have a baseline of those standards of performance, and we have these for you. So we have specific standards of performance that tackle those behavioral and technical skills of what our staff need to do. Right? They've all been vetted by our medical director and public health officials, really when focusing on those 4 key areas: their appearance and hygiene, managing those work environments, products and services, and then that communication. We've detailed out some of those phrases in these manuals. And if you were on the call last week, you've got one of those behavioral SOP manuals or standards of performance manuals, and we'll continue to send that out. So everyone on the call today will receive their own copy of our standards of performance manuals in relation to the behavioral tasks in this COVID-19 environment. And take a look at those phrases. We've added those in there for you, but we're here to help and continue to craft a message which works great for your organization. Second step, we got to train. We have to train those individuals who will be delivering these messages. And we have a couple of solutions to do that. The first of which are our training session plans. And these session plans help to guide you to come up with short 3 to 5 minute on-the-job training sessions that are really focused on these key behaviors. We have role play scenarios in there. We have strong questions, and really helps you to customize this training to you and to your organization. One thing that we are now excited to really announce is we'll be coming up with e-learnings as well to help reinforce these training sessions. So in the coming weeks, we're hoping to have it out by next Friday on our call, is some e-learning modules which you can purchase and provide to your staff on how and what to do in these circumstances. Quick 20-minute e-learnings that allow you to practice and get some more knowledge on these specific behaviors. So be on the lookout for those. But these are an example of our training sessions, our session plans that we currently have available on our website for purchase. You'll see those questions, you'll see those standards, and you'll see those role plays in there as well. Last step, on the job coaching. This is by far the most important step. I said it last week, I say it again. We have to have a culture of coaching. And it all starts with understanding what that gap is between what you've seen, what you observed, and what is the required level of that attitude, skill, and knowledge. We do that through observations, reports, and that guest feedback. And if our leaders are consistently using those training sessions, both on the job and even more so our e-learnings, which are shortly coming out to you, and we coach corrective and reinforcement coaching, that's going to lead to improving our guest experience. So coaching is really key in this moment, especially because a lot of these behaviors are going to be new. It's going to be staff trying things out and really experimenting in this new environment. And if you're not coaching them on how it went well or how it didn't go, you're going to fail. It's not going to be successful in the end. So coaching is really key, and it has to happen on the job. I'll just close with coming back to our change model, change curve model here, and really, again, touching on that our guests are going through these different phases. Right? They might be in denial, they might be in resistance, they might be going through exploration. But for me, last week I talked a lot about exploration. I think it's changed a little bit when we're dealing with demanding situations. You might see them resisting a lot of these protocols, these new environments. But if we can use a demanding situation to diffuse that demanding situation, use the right words, the right tone, the right inflection, we're going to get them to accept whatever that scenario or that option is. And I'm not saying acceptance equals approval, but at least they're going to accept what that option is or accept that policy or procedure a little bit differently. We don't have to get everyone to approve or agree with what we do. We just want to get them to accept this change and be more comfortable with it. So these demanding situations, they matter, and they go a long way to getting our guests closer to accepting this new environment and these new changes. So that's all we have for today. I'll take a look at the chat and see if we have any questions, and maybe we can answer those. But if not, for the interest of time, we'll definitely close this down and give you some time back in your day. I do want to highlight that next week, we're going to change our focus and we're going to talk about supporting our internal guests. So our staff members, our teams, how are we helping them navigate all of this change? That'll be the topic for next week. Kevin, anything that you've seen come up in the chat?
I just got one now that you ask. What do you recommend on doing when you have a hyper-focused and a dismissive guest argue or fight in the hotel, such as at check-in, in the restaurant, or in the public space or hallway? It's a great question.
It's a great question. Kevin, you want to start? And
Yeah, you know, actually, it's funny because we actually had a scenario in one of our clients 2 weeks ago. You know, we treated it exactly similar to the same way you would pre-COVID-19. I mean, you know, Andrew alluded to or mentioned our tone, the inflection and the tone of our voice really goes a long way. That's over 40% of the message we deliver it comes from our tone and our inflection. The words really only account for 7% of the total message. So, you know, that's kind of key first and foremost to handle those moments. I think secondly, Andrew talked a lot about empathy. You know, when I have a guest yelling at me, for example, one of the ways that I'm able to put myself in their shoes is I just ask myself, what would get me this angry? What would make me this mad? Because the fact is, once you're able to empathize with someone truly and put yourself in their shoes, what you do and say will naturally be the right thing because you've come to that understanding and that empathy with that individual. So with all of that said, you know, those to kind of the step one. You know, your second step is to remove each component from the other, and that could be done in a multitude of ways. In the case we had 2 weeks ago, the dismissive individual, the individual that was kind of the starting the confrontation, we were very easily able to offer him a beverage at the bar and you know, just pull him away to say, can we buy you a drink and talk more about what upset you? And then that allowed us to separate the two guests and then, you know, speak to the confrontational one a little bit further and really drill into what his frustration was. And it boiled down to be the over analyzing. He felt that all eyes were on him because he wasn't wearing a mask, and that this particular guest was, you know, might have been frustrated with him, and it just really sent him over the edge. And I think through the conversation, it was just like Andrew alluded to. you're trying to contact people on the phone, you get the runaround. And so all of this is just building in the background before this individual even walked in the door. And, it just exploded. So it is a great question. And I think ultimately what we hoped to do today was to really give you some of the questions and thoughts to be asking of your team. Because without preparing them, they're going to see a whole lot of new situations come their way, and how we handle it makes the biggest difference. I think we had a request to put the slide up, Andrew, there for the triggers of demanding situations. I'm going to assume that was for the dismissive guest. Just as a reminder, we are going to send you out this deck too, so you'll have all of this to reference should you want to pull something for your team.
Yeah, and Kevin, I just want to add on Sanders' question. I think it's great. Again, it goes back to taking that empathy and what else is that guest going through. That interaction or that fight that they're having with the hyper-focused guest probably isn't the real root of the cause or the real cause of why they're upset. So really, like Kevin said, separate the environments, find out what's going on, and maybe it's something larger. Maybe it's something else going on that you have to deal with. So thanks for asking it. Well done. All right, we'll take one more question. Would you recommend a hotel separating the hotel into hyper-focused floors and dismissive floors? I think in a perfect world, great, yes, but you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have these hyper-focused and dismissive guests going in and out of these different phases in different interactions, right? You could be hyper-focused 1 minute and dismissive the next. So I don't think you really need to separate the hotel floors. You're just going to have to be prepared with dealing with those different triggers and those different actions of an individual. So you can do your best to try to do that, but really at the end of the day, you're going to have to deal with the guest as they're approaching you and as you're interacting and picking up on those different cues. So, but great thought. Kevin?
Yeah, I would just add, Sandra, thank you for bringing that up. Some of the things we may have to do is change our business structure and our business model. Now, I don't know if you have that capability to do that. I don't think it would be business savvy to do that. But what I can tell you that we've experienced here in the U.S., I think we've been open a little longer than even some of the other countries, and we saw a large percentage or a larger percentage of the dismissive guests at first. And as time goes by, you're getting more of a blend. And we're finding a lot more people in the middle. So I know we focused on those two opposite spectrums, and it's great to prepare for those. But I can tell you just from personal experience and the clients we worked with, we really are seeing the middle of the road guest a lot more frequently. And even the dismissive and the hypersensitive are somewhat a little more forgiving and a little more understanding with the environment that goes on. So the guest has changed as well as we have to change. I would only recommend changing floors if you had person A and person B checking in and they got in a fight. You definitely don't want them in room 200 and 201 to help prevent that.
Great. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. In the interest of time, we'll make sure we give some time back, hopefully, to all of you. Thanks again. Please join us next week. Again, internal guest. We're going to focus inward and see how we help one another. So thanks again. Be on the lookout for the resources like Kevin mentioned and the full recording of the call. And look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.